Now we will have a wonderful presentation given by Mr. Jerry Lomshek, worst mining disaster in Crawford County. You're up, mister.
Okay.
I even got your book here, Jerry. if you
Oh,
need it.
okay. All right.
Oh, we can give you a podium.
Oh, well, thanks. Thanks. That helps.
It'll make
That
you
helps.
feel real
Yeah.
at home.
Yeah, as she said, my name is Jerry Lomshek, and I'm a local historian. I live at Chicopee, and I first started working on genealogy when I was 14, so I've been at that for some time, a number of years now. And shortly after that, I started working on local history as well. And I've done that my whole life, actually. What I'm going to talk to you tonight is about the Frontenac mine explosion in 1888. And it was not only the largest disaster in Crawford County, it was the largest mining disaster in Kansas that ever happened. It happened on the 9th of November, 1888. And it happened at mine number 2 that belonged to the Cherokee and Pittsburgh Coal and Mining Company. It was located about a half a mile to the northeast of Frontenac. If you go up Cayuga, which is that East Street in Frontenac going north, it's just to the east of where the beer distributor building is now, set back in there. It's dug up in strip pits now, but that's where mine number 2 set. I first began to research about this occurrence in the spring of 1986. I had gone back to get a bachelor's degree at PSU, and I was taking a historical research class from Dr. Dudley Cornish. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him. He was an excellent instructor and a real historian. His book on the Sable Arm, the black soldiers in the Civil War, is still a real resource for that information. And with that, while I was taking that class, I wrote the first paper dealing with the Frontenac mine explosion. Then in 2002, a young man by the name of Jeff Scott, who was 17 years old, who was working on his Eagle Scout badge, and he decided to take up the project of placing markers on the mass graves for those miners that was killed in that explosion. And he asked me to help him. So we did a lot more research on that and the miners involved with that at that time. On that day, on the 9th of November, 1888, there was a young man, James W. Wilson. He was 17 years old, and he went to work on that Friday morning at mine number 2. It was a cold, wet, steel gray day, kind of like today, I guess, and it was in late fall, and he would not see the light of day again. He lived with his parents on a farm north of Frontenac. His father, by the name of Richard, he was an experienced miner, and he had quit work at number 2 just 2 weeks before this happened due to the daily small explosions that had occurred in the mine, and after 4 men had been burned there. He also complained about the inexperienced miners on the east side of the mine. At that time, Cherokee and Crawford counties was right in the midst of a major coal boom, and it was rapidly expanding at that time. The coal fields really boomed there between 1885 and 1890. To give you an example of how much that influenced this area, in 1869, there was only 37,000 tons of coal was produced in southeast Kansas. In 1888, when this occurred, there was 1,850,000 tons of coal produced that year. So you can see how much growth there was in that industry at that time. The Cherokee in Pittsburgh was the coal branch of the Santa Fe Railroad. The state of Kansas had laws that the railroads could not own coal mines. Well, it didn't take very long, and the railroads wised up to that. So what they did is they formed a corporation which they owned and named it the Cherokee in Pittsburgh, and they mined coal then, because the railroads was one of the main users of coal at that time. The Cherokee in Pittsburgh, like I said, was the coal branch of the Santa Fe Railroad, and they had began up in Osage County, south of Topeka, in 1886, and then they came to Crawford County that same year and sank mine number 1 and 2 there at Frontenac. Mine number 2 was considered the finest, most modern mine in Kansas at the time when it was sunk. It was a double entry system. It was self-dumping of the coal. It had automatic cages. Cages were the elevators going up and down the shaft. And it was the first in Kansas to have automatic cages. It had a steam plant. It had hoisting machinery, and ventilation was the best in the district at that time. The shaft was 113 feet deep. The coal vein was 36 to 43 inches. And that's always something to think about, because if you were working in a room in the coal mine, if you were the miner in that room, you would be working in a space 36 to 43 inches deep. So virtually you'd be on your knees all day. Number 2 was sunk in November of 1886, but was not open for production until April of 1887. So just not too long before the explosion occurred. It was a twin to mine number 1, which was just a half a mile to the southwest from number 2. And those two mines created the coal camp of Frontenac. The miners fixed their own shots at that time, and they used black powder. In 1885, a law was passed in the state of Kansas that would limit the amount of powder that the miners could take into the mine to 5 pounds. And that was mostly ignored because it was not an adequate amount for them to use. So there was some of the miners would take up to 25 pounds of powder into the mine at one time. One of the techniques in mining was in the room, you would cut at the bottom of the room, at the bottom of the coal vein, and then you would place your shots and blast that down to take the coal out. By doing that, you could get larger chunks of coal, and that's important. The price of coal was always based on the size of the chunks of coal. The larger the chunk of coal, the better price, okay? And at that time, there was like chunk coal like that, the large pieces. Nut coal, it was kind of like what you'd use to burn in a house. And then there was slack, just the small stuff. At that time, miners weren't even paid for the slack, okay? But the coal mine would sell slack, okay, but they didn't pay the miners for that. At number 2, they would often place 3 shots at the end of the room at one time to blast the coal loose. And that created a lot of coal dust, no doubt. Now remember that the miners shot their own, blasted their own shots. So at noon and at the end of the day, they would fire their shots with all of the miners still in the mine. Okay. Number 2 was a dry mine, and it had been sprinkled at times to hold down the dust, but that was infrequently done. James Wilson, that I talked about earlier, worked on the east side, and about 5:15 in the evening, he had placed his shots, and among those 3 that he placed, one of those was what they called a windy shot. A windy shot was usually because they overpacked too much powder into the hole that they dug in there to place the shot. And when that happened, instead of blowing the coal loose, it would shoot out of the hole with flame. And with that, it ignited the coal dust, which was thick in that mine at that time, because now you have all kinds of explosions going on down there as everybody fired off their shots. From his room, it went out into the entry and ignited his powder keg. and it killed him. Then it went down the entry being the larger excavation there between rooms, and ignited 4 or 5 more powder kegs. As the survivors attempted to escape through an air shaft, the air shaft had a large fan above it, and it was to push air down into the mine to keep adequate ventilation in the mine. There was so many in this mine at that time, and it was large enough that the west side, the miners on the west side, didn't even know what had happened. They was unaware that that had happened, and so they kept firing shots on the west side. There was actually little damage done to the mine itself. There was some damage to some of the timbers in the hoisting shaft, in the main shaft. There was a few timbers blown out in the entries, and there was some rock falls from the ceilings from the blast, and part of the fan housing was blown off, but the fan kept running. Wives and families, as that occurred, knew that there was some kind of disaster had happened at the mine, and they gathered at the shaft despite the rain and the cold that evening. Rain and snow that evening. There was doctors from Pittsburgh, Girard, and Litchfield came to help in that situation. Large fires were built near the shaft for the families that were standing around to await who would survive out of that disaster. They quickly repaired the fan housing, the housing around the fan, and got that working again so that they could ventilate the mine again. At 7 p.m. was the first rescue party attempted to go into the mine to bring survivors out, but they were forced back because of the noxious fumes still in the mine at that time. At 9 o'clock, they tried again. The second rescue party attempted, and they also were forced back. Finally, about midnight, they were able to succeed in getting into the mine. And as they went down, they found bodies there. The bodies was taken out to the wash house. There was a wash house there where miners could wash up before they go home. But after they had brought out 10 bodies, there wasn't enough room anymore, and so they began to take the remainder of the bodies to the hay barn, which was about 200 yards to the west of the mine. Now remember that the mines worked with mules down in the mine, so all of them had a hay barn close by where they could feed their mules. By Saturday on the 10th, there was 37 bodies had been brought up, and they were difficult to identify because of the burns and that type of thing. They tried to count the number who had escaped, but that was impossible to do. That morning, there was known to be 164 men had gone to work, but it was unknown how many may have gone to work via the air shaft because they could go in that way too, or came out that way when after the explosion occurred, some of them escaped out of the air shaft. Ended up 44 were killed, 39 were injured. That was approximately 1/4 of the miners that was in the mine that day that we know of. Excuse me. There was some possibility there may have been as many as 232 men in the mine that day, but we know for certain that there was 164. There was, the injured were cared for in the blacksmith shop. Now, I'm an RN, and I can imagine trying to take care of your patients in a blacksmith shop, not really your best conditions to take care of people with burns and that type of thing. There was 13 men treated there, and most of those had burns or had inhaled noxious gases of some type, and so they had lung problems. Some were later taken to the Santa Fe Hospital in Ottawa. George Finley was the state mine inspector at that time, and he arrived on Saturday from Topeka. He had never inspected the mine, although he was required to do that twice a year. He had never been in the mine. Robert Craig, who was the general superintendent for the Cherokee and Pittsburgh mines, lived in Osage City, and he arrived Saturday as well, and he took charge of the situation at that time. Dr. Charles Fisher was Crawford County coroner, and he impaneled an inquest jury to view the bodies. And it was rumored that the company wanted to bury the dead quickly on Sunday. But Pittsburgh Mayor William Lanyon stopped that. However, a few families did bury their dead that day. Sunday at 5 a.m., one of the miners, Harry Burns, staggered out of the east side of the mine after the search had already been abandoned. He had been with 24 hours. He was sent home to Girard, where he boarded. But however, he died on November the 15th from the effects of black damp, what they call black damp, which was some of the noxious fumes made up of nitrogen and carbon dioxide. Monday was a clear and warm day. It warmed up. Pittsburgh closed their businesses for the funeral that day. Santa Fe train pulled out of Frontenac at 11 a.m. with the coffins on flat cars and grieving families in the passenger cars. Arriving at Pittsburgh, they took 17 coffins, were unloaded, and taken to Our Lady of Lourdes Catholic Church. Due to a lack of space, they were left on the wagon instead of being taken into the church, while Father Zvachik held services for those 17. Those were the Catholic miners. The procession to the cemetery was 1 mile to the south, and it was reported that 1,000 people followed that cortege down there. The train continued south to Quincy Street, and the rest of the coffins were removed there and taken to Mount Olive Cemetery. And the services were held there for those miners, and it was reported that there may have been 3,000 at Mount Olive Cemetery for that funeral. And those were most of those were buried in a mass grave there. At 4 o'clock on Monday afternoon, Dr. Fisher, the coroner, again began his inquest, which would continue through Thursday, and it ended at 10:30 in the evening, and the coal company was censured for the lack of care in the mine. There was some question was where that explosion had actually started, and so Robert Craig, remember he's the general superintendent, he took a couple of witnesses with him, and they were experienced miners. And on November the 20th, they went into the mine and they mined out James Wilson's shot and found out that it was truly the windy shot that had started the explosion. Again, as I mentioned before, there was 44 killed there. There was 37 was killed immediately. On November the 10th, there was 3 more that died, and then there was 1 each on November the 12th, 15th, 17th, and the 27th. The last was Thomas Lomshek, and he died on November the 27th. He was about 38 years old, and he had been born in England and was an English miner. He had a wife and 2 young children. His wife, as happened with a lot of these wives, married Thomas Rowe, who was also injured in that explosion on the 30th of March, 1889, so just within a few months she remarried. The oldest killed in the mine was 45 years old. The youngest was 13. There was 3 that was 40 years old. There was 25 that was 30 years old. 20 were 20 years old, and there was 6 teenagers, with 2 being 13. You know, that's a very difficult occupation, and old men aren't going to be working in a coal mine. It was usually younger men like that. 26 of the 44 were single, 16 were married, and 2 were widowers. 14 had children, and 2 left a pregnant wife. The wives left without any kind of support. They did have donations taken up. The miners donated all across the coal fields for them, but it was really difficult. There was no welfare system at that time, and that's why, as you follow those wives, a lot of those remarried, as Mrs. Lomshek did, right away, because otherwise they'd have no support, especially if they had children as well. A number of those brought suit, the family members brought suit against the coal company And of course, the coal company was wealthy, and that continued for a number of years. I've tracked some of those lawsuits almost 10 years later before they finally got settled. Tuesday evening, that would be the day after the funeral, there was a meeting held in the Pittsburgh City Hall by the miners, and they formed a relief committee to aid the survivors. They demanded that Finley, the state mine inspector, be removed, and a board of inquiry was created with 2 miners, two coal company men, and 1 man chosen by those 4. In mid-December, there was a state convention of miners in Pittsburgh, and they sent a delegation to the governor to replace Finley with a practical miner. Shortly, he was replaced, and John Stewart of Scammon was appointed in his place. And John Stewart was a practical miner, and after that, it was always a practical miner that got that position. Some of the laws of mining in the state of Kansas was, the first laws was in 1875, and it said that every mine would have 2 shafts, one for hoisting and one for ventilation, as I mentioned earlier, air shaft, and also an escape shaft, as was used in this disaster. And like I said, it was often used or talked as a walkout. It was another way for them to leave the mine. In 1883, there was additional laws passed that the mines would be mapped, and there would be signaling in the hoisting. In other words, you couldn't raise the cages or the elevators out of the shaft without having some kind of an alarm to alert the miners that that was happening, so that would prevent injuries there. Also required adequate ventilation, and also mine bosses, that experienced miners would be appointed as a mine boss to make sure that things were done as they should be in the mine. And also in 1883, with those laws, it created the position of the state mine inspector. Late January of 1889, Representative John Herron, that was from Cherokee, introduced a bill requiring shot fires, and that was passed by both houses at the end of February, and other requirements regarding shot placement. Now, that was a major change in mining in the state of Kansas. A shot fire then the miners could not fire their own shots. They would place their shots, and at the end of the day when they left, then the shot fires would go to work, and they would set off all of those shots in the evening when there wasn't any other miners there. There would still be explosions in the mine, but we didn't have this kind of a disaster anymore. There was a lot of shot firemen killed, however, when that might happen. Stewart, that was now the mine inspector, was realizing that it was impractical to limit the amount of powder to 5 pounds, and he got a law obtained through the legislature to change that to 12.5 pounds in 1891. The legislature mandated sprinkling of dusty mines in 1895, and the mine rescue legislation didn't develop until 1913. And that's when you would see established here in the coal fields rescue stations with training for some of the miners in case there was a disaster in the mine. But like I say, that was delayed until 1913. So although from these deaths it did bring about a lot of changes in the mining industry, so their death was not in vain. Another effect of that was, I'm thoroughly convinced that brought about unionization in the coal mines. The unionization in the coal mines started with United Mine Workers in the fall of 1892, and they had pretty well unionized the field by 1893, and they called a major strike here in the coal fields in May of 1893 that would persist for 5 months. And finally the coal companies won out because the miners didn't have any other means of support, and so they finally gave that up. And so through the 90s, the unionization attempt was pretty weak. Finally, at the end of the 1890s, in 1898, they kind of reorganized again, and in 1899 there was another major strike in the coal fields, all across the coal fields, and that time the miners won out and they stayed unionized ever after that. Mine number 2 reopened in January of 1889, and it had 102 miners when it reopened. In 1893, they were wanting 500 miners in that mine, so it was a major mine. You know, if you had 400 to 500 miners in a mine, that was a huge one. I've seen some of those maps that the mine would cover a whole square mile underground. Finally, number 2 was abandoned in April of 1896 when it had worked out. Of those killed, 12 were American born, several were sons of immigrants, 32 were foreign born, 8 were French or Belgian, 8 were German, 3 were English, 2 were Scotch, 1 was Irish, 1 was Norwegian, and 1 was Austrian. So it was a real mixture of ethnic groups there, which persisted throughout southeast Kansas. 14 had declared intention to become citizens of those 44, 1 each in 1883, 1884, and 1887. 7 declared their intention in October of 1888, just the month before that happened. And 4 had declared their intention just the week before the explosion. There was two sets of brothers killed. Auguste Emil and Emil Barbier were 2 of the brothers that was killed. They were both from France. Auguste had a wife that was still in France. She had never come over yet. Emil was single, and he had declared for citizenship on the 1st of November 1888, just a week before he was killed. The other set of brothers was Edward and Leon Malley. Edward had declared for citizenship on the 11th of October. He had a wife and 2 children, and his wife was pregnant at the time. His brother Leon had declared for citizenship on the 1st of November, so just the week before also. They had come from France in December of 1887, so they hadn't been here quite a year at the time that that happened. That family, the Malley family, if you're familiar with Pittsburgh a little bit, there was the Malley service station there at Broadway and Quincy Street was descendant of that family. Edward, as I mentioned, was married at the time and his wife was pregnant. They had another brother, Simeon Arthur Malley, and he did not go to work that day. He would have been there, but he didn't go to work that day. And he later married Edward's wife, Irma. And so the descendants, like the ones that ran the service station, were from that couple. There was one father and son that was killed, and that was John Weisenberger and his son George, who was 19 years old. Julius Lafort had worked there at number 2 mine, and he had taken the day off that day. His wife had had a baby daughter at 3 that morning, and his father-in-law, Alexander Lacalle, is another Frenchman. Alexander was 40 years old, and he was walking to the mine that morning, and Julius said, "Come in and see your new granddaughter." And he said, "No, I'll see him when I come home this evening." Alexander was one of the 44 that was killed. So the baby girl had saved Julius's life. The known burial places, we know 38 of the 44 where they're buried. There's 19 buried at St. Mary's, and 16 of those are in a mass grave there. 13 are buried at Mount Olive, and 9 of those are in a mass grave there. There was 2 in Hobson Cemetery. I don't know if you're familiar with Hobson Cemetery. Hobson is actually the first Pittsburgh cemetery, and as you turn into Highland Park, there just to the south of the entrance, that's actually a separate cemetery, and that's Hobson Cemetery there. And there's 2 of those that Weisenberger and his son are buried there. There's one buried at Hosey Hill in Weir. There's one buried at St. Bridget's in Scammon. There was one that was sent to Baltimore, Maryland, and one sent to Danville, Ohio. There was a 26-year-old that got killed. His name was Alfred Youngkin, and his wife had arrived from Germany the week of the explosion. Now you can imagine she gets here that week, her husband's killed, and she's stranded here, at that time. I want to talk just a little bit about the Cherokee County victims in that explosion. One was William Elwood Jr. He was 19 years old, and it was just 20 days before his 20th birthday. He was the son of William and Hannah Elwood. Hannah was born in England in 1840, and she died 12 days after the explosion from pneumonia. His dad was pit boss at number 2. His brother Joseph also worked at number 2, but he escaped. William was buried at Hosey Hill Cemetery along with his mother and later on his father, and he died the day after the explosion on November the 10th in the mine blacksmith shop, as I mentioned earlier. The next one is John or Johnny O'Connor, and he was 23 years old, and he lived at Scammon. He was the son of Anthony and Elizabeth O'Connor, and he worked as a trapper in mine number 2. A trapper was within the entries. There was canvas doors in those entries, and they had a trapper there that would open and close those doors to allow for ventilation. Whenever the mules are bringing carloads through there, they would open it up and then close it again to shuffle the air current to another part of the mine, something like that. And that's what John's job was, to do that. He died on November the 9th, the day of the explosion, from burns, and he was buried at St. Bridget's Cemetery. He was a member of the Knights of Labor Assembly 535 at Scammon. The Knights of Labor was kind of the first attempt in the U.S. to unionize, and everybody was included in the Knights of Labor. It could be farmers, it could be miners, everything. Finally, that decided this isn't working too well, so they broke it apart, and the miners actually became the United Mine Workers then. So it was kind of a predecessor of the United Mine Workers is what that was. One other was William A. Foster. He was 26 years old, and he worked as a driver, and number 2, a driver would be the ones that drove the mules back and forth to the rooms. His wife, Ella, would bring suit against the coal company later on. In 1888, he was living in Scammon, but he was buried in the mass grave at Mount Olive Cemetery in Pittsburgh, and he died on the day of the explosion on November the 9th. I've continued to add things to this story as it went along. As a historian, you keep finding things, and add a little bit more to it. I know you have a copy of it here. This was the manuscript that I wrote about the explosion, starting with when I was in PSU, and then when I added to it in 2008. And a couple of things that have come up, since that time was James O'Hara was one of the ones that was killed there in the mine, and he was 34 years old, but he was a single guy. And it was originally thought that he was buried in the mass grave at St. Mary's, but it was later found that his tombstone was separate from that, and so he was buried in another part of the cemetery there. And he was a member of the Ancient Order of Hibernians. That was a fraternal lodge of the Irish people. It's still in existence in some places in the States. I did a long search to try to find out where James Wilson was buried, because I knew that he would not be buried in the mass grave. His father would have never allowed that. His father brought suit against the coal company and everything else, so I knew he wouldn't be buried in the mass grave. And finally, then I found that he was buried at Mount Olive Cemetery in a separate location. And the research continues. I'll tell you just a little bit about trying to find those mass graves. The ones at St. Mary's was pretty easy. Luckily, there was a map that showed the location of that mass grave. And from the church records at St. Mary's there in Pittsburgh, it listed all of those victims, and so we could identify who was buried there. At Mount Carmel, that was more difficult. Nobody knew where that mass grave was. So this Jeff Scott, this young boy, when he was working on his Eagle Scout badge, we went to the City Hall in Pittsburgh, and they had the records for Mount Olive Cemetery. And what they did is they had a card for each lot in the cemetery. When that had occurred, Mount Olive was just brand new. It had only opened that same year. And at that time, they didn't record who was buried there. They would record who bought the lot. So Jeff and I spent most of the day going through every card that they had in that file cabinet until we found one that was 12 lots bought by the Pittsburgh and Cherokee Coal Company, and those were the only lots that the coal company bought at Mount Olive, so we were able to identify that. It did not list who was buried there, and so we can't say for sure. Jeff and I went through the whole list of the 44 and tried to determine like where each one was buried, and when we got through, we came up with 9 names, and that's how many was buried in the mass grave. So we think we know it, but we can't say for sure that that's what it was. So anyway, you have any questions? That kind of, and like I say, the research will continue on that as long as I'm around, I guess. You know, I'll keep finding other things. So,
Is your presumption that they're buried in the mass graves because their families were unable to purchase lots and headstones?
right? Yeah. A lot of those were single men. You know. So.
And you and this young man were got the headstones put on
Yes.
for these.
Yeah, and that
Were there
yeah.
was no headstones when the companies did it. They
No,
just
no,
put
they
them in
were
the ground there.
Yeah, they was totally unmarked. You know, until, in fact, I just failed to mention that Jeff was the one that raised the funds for the stones, and they're nice sized stones, and he raised sufficient funds to do that. And the stone at St. Mary's was dedicated on June of 2002, and the one at Mount Olive in April of 2005. You know, so they're marked now. You know, we were able to list all the names on the one at St. Mary's, but we couldn't on the one at Mount Olive. So.
You said that the lawsuits went on for 10 years before they were resolved. Did the families get any money from the companies?
Yeah, they did get some money at the end of it. You know, yeah. But it was a long haul before they got anything. You know.
And I was kind of wondering at the time, now we're talking 1899?
Yeah, I think 1897.
1897 was the accident. Did they have oxygen at that time that they could treat the patients with?
No.
There was none of that at that time?
No. Yeah, that was pretty rough when I thought of it as a nurse, you know, trying to care for those injured in a blacksmith shop. That's pretty rough, you know.
It is surprising to know that each individual miner was allowed to handle the explosives themselves. Even an 18-year-old kid.
Yeah.
So not surprising that accidents like that would
Yeah,
happen.
yeah. One thing I might mention too was it was not unusual to have kids in the mine. A lot of the dads would take their sons to work with them because they could. You were paid by the amount of coal that you produced. You weren't paid by the hour or anything like that. So if you had some young sons that could go to work with you, they could be loading the coal car while you were mining the coal, and you could produce more coal that way. So I have some records of somebody as young as 10 being killed in the mines. You know, that was the largest disaster that happened in the mines, but there was a lot of deaths in the mines, and most of that was from rock falls, where the ceiling would fall on them.
You mentioned how short the interior was, so it would be to your advantage to have some small people working.
Yeah. I don't know if you've been to the Miners Hall Museum, but they do have one pair of pants there that's a miner's pants, And if you look at that, those knees are padded because you're going to be on your knees all day, you know. And about the only way you could keep going probably, you know, was to have those padded. So, any other questions? Okay. Well, appreciate you having me here to talk to you. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Jerry.
Sure. Thank you, Ella.